Uncontrolled campaign finance systems undermine democracy not just through explicit corruption, but through the very architecture of incentives they create. When electoral competition becomes structurally dependent on large-scale fundraising, a reinforcing dynamic emerges in which dependency reshapes representation, representation reshapes governance priorities, and degraded governance further intensifies financial dependency. The resulting transformation is gradual rather than dramatic, yet history shows us how it causes institutional instability. The first stage of the reinforcing cycle begins with the architecture of dependency. Modern elections, particularly in large, media-saturated democracies, are expensive enterprises. Candidates must finance advertising, staff, data operations, legal compliance, and constant voter outreach. When the cost threshold rises beyond what small-scale contributions can reliably sustain, political viability increasingly depends on concentrated funding sources, major donors, political action committees, and aligned expenditure networks. This dependence functions as structural gatekeeping. It does not require explicit quid pro quo arrangements. The mere fact that political survival hinges on sustained access to capital alters incentive structures. Individuals capable of mobilizing large financial resources acquire disproportionate relevance in the political process. The second stage is embedded influence. Office holders operating within a high-cost electoral environment internalize the preferences of those who ensure their viability. This internalization is anticipatory rather than transactional. It is rarely necessary for donors to issue explicit demands. Office holders learn which policy signals are rewarded with financial support and which jeopardize future backing. Over time, an access market normalizes. Meetings, policy briefings, and agenda-setting opportunities cluster around those with demonstrated financial leverage. Influence becomes routinized and institutionalized, not as corruption in the criminal sense, but as alignment in the structural sense. The political system adapts to the reality that money sustains competition. The third stage is degradation of the government's capability to provide public goods. When agenda access is filtered through capital-intensive channels, diffuse public goods struggle to compete. Issues that lack concentrated financial sponsors, long-term infrastructure maintenance, administrative simplification, regulatory clarity, local community resilience, receive less sustained attention. Additionally, elected officials must devote significant portions of their time to fundraising activities, diminishing the time available for policy development and oversight. Legislative bodies gradually shift from governance arenas to campaign perpetuation arenas. The state's ability to generate broad-based public goods weakens, not because of overt sabotage, but because institutional time and energy are reallocated toward survival within a high-cost competition model. Once capability degrades, reinforcement intensifies. Public dissatisfaction with governmental performance increases electoral volatility and media scrutiny. Volatility makes campaigns more competitive and therefore more expensive. Heightened expense deepens dependency architecture, completing the cycle. What begins as financial necessity evolves into structural reliance. Historical precedent illustrates how such loops develop. During the late 19th century in the United States, electoral competition expanded alongside industrial capitalism. Corporate wealth became an essential source of campaign funding. The 1896 presidential campaign, directed financially by Mark Hanna on behalf of William McKinley, demonstrated the scale at which concentrated capital could shape national political outcomes. Corporate contributions were legal and normalized, yet the alignment between industrial interests and policy outcomes became increasingly visible, contributing to public concern about monopolies, labor suppression, and political machines. Reform movements followed, culminating in measures such as the Tillman Act of 1907, which prohibited corporate contributions to federal campaigns. Reformers understood that concentrated financial dependency eroded representative equality even in the absence of criminal conduct. A more distant example can be found in the late Roman Republic. Electoral competition required substantial personal expenditure. Candidates funded public games and distributed goods to cultivate popular favor. Political survival depended on patronage networks and personal wealth. As the cost of political competition escalated, governance increasingly revolved around elite rivalry and factional alignment. Administrative stability and public welfare became secondary to competition for power. While Rome's transformation into imperial rule involved many factors, the capital-intensive structure of republican politics contributed to the erosion of equal representation and institutional resilience. In contemporary contexts, judicial decisions such as Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission and SpeechNow.org versus FEC reshaped the regulatory boundaries of campaign finance by expanding protections for independent expenditures. These rulings did not legalize direct bribery, but altered the architecture of political spending. Independent expenditure organizations can now deploy substantial resources in support of or opposition to candidates, increasing the scale of electoral spending. The structural consequence is reinforcement of financial dependency, particularly in competitive races where outside spending may decisively affect visibility and messaging. The public good consequences of this reinforcement loop can be conceptualized as a negation sequence. When political viability depends disproportionately on concentrated capital, functional political equality declines. Voting rights remain formally equal, yet the distribution of effective voice becomes weighted toward those able to finance amplification. As equality of voice declines, representational fairness weakens. Issues lacking sponsor backing struggle to penetrate the agenda. Citizens whose concerns are diffuse or geographically dispersed perceive diminished responsiveness. Over time, institutional responsiveness itself appears compromised. When electoral participation does not meaningfully alter policy trajectories, democratic engagement feels increasingly futile. That perception feeds back into the belief that political equality has collapsed, reinforcing disengagement and distrust. The generalized lesson across historical and contemporary cases is that campaign finance systems influence regime stability not through isolated scandals, but through cumulative incentive drift. Legal permissibility does not neutralize structural distortion. When dependency becomes infrastructural, influence embeds, and public goods lose priority. The deterioration is subtle at first. No single act appears catastrophic. Yet over successive cycles, representational asymmetry deepens and institutional capacity weakens. In the present United States, several indicators suggest movement along this reinforcement path. Campaign expenditures continue to rise. Fundraising operates continuously rather than episodically. Competitive races depend heavily on concentrated funding streams. Public trust in Congress remains historically low, and dissatisfaction with institutional responsiveness is widespread. None of these facts alone demonstrate systemic collapse. However, they align with early stages of a structural reinforcement dynamic that history associates with democratic erosion. The warning is not that financial influence inevitably destroys democracy. Democracies have repeatedly adapted through transparency reforms, public financing mechanisms, disclosure requirements, and small donor matching systems. The warning is that when financial dependency expands faster than corrective safeguards, political equality degrades in practice before it degrades in law. If citizens increasingly perceive that policy outcomes are structurally pre-aligned with capital rather than responsive to electorate-wide preferences, legitimacy erodes. Once legitimacy erodes sufficiently, political conflict intensifies in domains far beyond campaign finance itself. Campaign finance reinforcement thus functions as an accelerant rather than a singular cause. It weakens the foundational public good of equal political voice. Left unchecked, this creates an environment in which polarization, enforcement disputes, and institutional mistrust grow.